This video is going to cover a few different topics. It is in part a direct reply to a question from a Patreon supporter about U.S. foreign policy, textbook political science, these kinds of classical questions. And it's in part a little bit more of a broad philosophical discussion of a subtle theme that has run through my channel since day one. The question of making I want statements. In politics, in your personal life, in human psychology, statements, I want blank, which is something we're culturally discouraged from doing, and that can sometimes be crucially important. And then that latter topic links to a whole bunch of other, I think, salient and meaningful questions in our lives, including even the never-ending controversy of natalist versus anti-natalist versus anti-antinatalist. I can't identify as a pro-natalist, but I'm an anti-antinatalist. So we begin. My best girl Melissa is sitting here off camera. Some of you guys will know I'm having her hang in on the video, as I like to say. So she's not under pressure to keep up constant witty banter, but she can comment any time, and it gives me someone to talk to rather than staring too intensely into the camera. Once in a while, there's a video, none of you knows this, that I want to do when I've really got to express rage or something at the camera, where I don't have her participating that way. But I like it. It gives a little bit more of a conversational tone, even if she doesn't say a word in my experience. All right. So my longtime supporter, Mohammed Socrates, wrote in. We are apparently going to meet, Mohammed, when we are in Europe, when we're in Brussels, not Paris, I believe. So we're making that happen. He writes, quote, thanks to the interesting video, which has raised for me a lot of interesting questions about your actual views concerning political theory. Do you think that spreading democracy is a good thing as such? I'd emphasize what makes this a difficult question is exactly the wording, as such, and that democracy in itself is a virtue regardless of the circumstances of its appearance. Ooh. So if you're a little bit of a cosmopolitan, well-educated person, that's a tough question to answer, and exactly we'll get back to why that is. Do you think that nations should care about? This is question 2, I guess. Do you think that nations should care about and intervene in other nations' affairs? So that's really the segue to this broader, more subtle philosophical thing I want to talk about here. And do you think there is some kind of moral justification or imperative for interventionism as it pertains to the United States in this century so far, et cetera? Yeah. So, actually, I think question 3 I can roll into question 1. All right. Do you think that spreading democracy is a good thing as such? So, guys, just lately we've been reading the classics again. I've been doing Aristotle, we've been doing Xenophon, Socrates, Plato, all kinds of ancient Greek, ancient Athenian stuff. In the real world, we have terrifying and fascinating examples like what happens when democracy arrives in Iran. Now, maybe to use one that my viewers will be more familiar with, September 11th, 2001 happens. The United States starts its endless war to reshape the map of Central Asia. What if, in the year 2002, the United States Army sweeps over Afghanistan, and then you create an Afghan democracy? Well, if you did that in the year 2002, they might well elect the Taliban. They might well elect the people you just kicked out of power. Certainly the vast majority of people in that country, if it's a democratic country at that time, 2002, were totally opposed to women's education. And when I say that, I don't just mean they were opposed to women getting PhDs or women becoming medical doctors. They were opposed to women getting basic literacy and, grade 5 education. So you guys may not know this. There's a whole crazy history now and billions of dollars spent of international agencies, sometimes United Nations, sometimes European Union or other donor nations, trying to educate traditional rural Muslims in Afghanistan to get them to accept the basic concept of female education. Not even female equality, but that girls can go to high school. And this kind of thing, it's been a huge battle. So if you have democracy in a country where the vast majority of people are religious fundamentalists, who are in favor of cutting the foreskin off of every male penis, who may be in favor of female genital mutilation. So I consider male circumcision genital mutilation. I consider female circumcision female genital mutilation. Then the question is, what good is democracy in the hands of this public, this polity. Now, I wasn't just lifting this book for the exercise it gives to my arm. Guys, I put up a graphic on Twitter recently showing just the succession of years as we make the transition from Herodotus to Thucydides, from Thucydides to Socrates, and then Socrates to Plato, Plato to Aristotle. It is all crowded together historically. All those lives overlap in dynamic ways. But really, Aristotle is kind of half a generation after Plato. Plato is half a generation after Socrates. You get this fine, the passage of time really matters in understanding politically what's going on. One of the big differences between Plato and Socrates is the overweening emphasis on public education. So if you think about what is the point of the discourse on democracy, for Socrates, all three of these people I'm going to name are basically pretty lukewarm. They're critics of democracy. Socrates is a critic of democracy. Plato is a critic of democracy. Aristotle is a critic of democracy in different ways, and we could digress for hours on this. However, if you even look at the structure of the organization of Aristotle's politics by Aristotle is really a thesis on the necessity of public education. And I see in Plato's just prior to Aristotle, he comes out of the crisis of seeing the execution of Socrates with this conclusion that, the ultimate priority we have to have for the future of Greece is public education. Now, the political context for this is, at that time, Athens did not have any system of public education whatsoever, and Athens had just lost the war against Sparta. Sparta, the country that won the war, was the one country that really did have a system of government-mandated, state-controlled, centralized public education. Now, that system of public education was horrifying. It was kind of a cartoonish supervillainy made into public education. It's unbelievable. But they could see, certainly people like Plato sat back in amazement and looked at the military, if not cultural and organizational superiority of Sparta, who didn't have a lot of other advantages. And they saw, wow, this is what having universal public education will do. And they saw also public education is creating equality in a sense that democracy in Athens was all about equality. Equality is still a huge theme in Aristotle. What does equality really mean? Well, equality is also linked to this issue of public education. So in the era of Socrates, his whole discourse is about virtue and voluntary poverty and manliness. And that carries on with the Cynics and the Stoics and other schools of philosophy carry that on. But what you get amongst the academics, Plato's Academy and then the Lyceum of Aristotle, it's a very different political discourse that is where ultimately the point of politics, or the plea of politics, is to make a shift to a system of public education. And that is exactly the crisis you're looking at. So you asked me this question, totally great question. Is democracy a good thing as such? Is democracy a virtue regardless of the circumstances of its appearance? Okay, so let's say the year is 2002. Really, the question is almost the same now in 2018. If the year is 2002 and we are suddenly the conquistadors of Afghanistan, we've just conquered Afghanistan. Sorry, in reality, how many years did it take for the United States to conquer any significant portion of Afghanistan? Took a long time. I'm sorry, I remember just a few years ago a detailed military report from the U.S. dealing with highway by highway how little control they had of the country, and I was like, "What? You're 10 years into the conflict, and major highways, and farmers can't sell their produce and so on because you guys don't control the highways and so on." So it was a long, hard war that I think some might say ended with mixed results or a stalemate. It wasn't. But let's say hypothetically, America rolls tanks and in the year 2002 they conquer Afghanistan instantly. What really are the options for democracy? This is why I'm saying I'm going to answer question 3, part and parcel of question 1. The pursuit of democracy in these conditions of inequality of education has almost always led to the creation of an elite, a left-winger could say a vanguard, who then rule in the name of democracy through completely non-democratic means. So now, in the reality of Afghanistan, who are the people you're going to select and cultivate and make into this ruling elite? They're going to be the most westernized people. So there's a technical term for this in political science. It's called a comprador elite. So, I mean, if you are Spanish colonists in South America or something, and you promise you're going to give people native self-government, who are the natives you're going to choose to gather? They're not going to be the examples of native religion. They're going to be the most westernized, the most intermixed with Western European, those who have received or appropriated the most of Spanish culture, Western culture, however you want to put it. So likewise, you have a situation where you're creating an elite in the capital city of people who are willing to work with the Americans, probably people who can speak or read a little bit of English, at any rate they can speak or read something, but possibly also people who maybe went away and got a technical education in something like engineering or medicine. They might not have got it in the West. Maybe they went and got an education in Saudi Arabia and came back. They went somewhere and came back. And now you have an elite in the capital. Then you enter, so this is really textbook political science. You get into what are called classical center-periphery conflicts. This happened in the Sudan. This happened in many Muslim countries, but also many non-Muslim countries, where you have people in the center, even though they claim they may rule in the name of democratic values, they are so alienated from the people of the countryside, or maybe even poor people in the capital city. The poor people in the countryside perhaps still support the Taliban or other Muslim fundamentalist groups like the Taliban. They represent a set of values, what have you, that are utterly incompatible with these people. They look at the ruling elite. They say, who are these people? I mean, just look at photographs of what the ruling elite was like in Iran before they had their revolution. They're wearing European suits. They're dressed up like Western Europeans. Many of them have gone away to study in Western Europe and come back. I remember a lecture from an Iranian guy was, you could tell politically where someone was about what kind of cup they drank coffee out of. They drank coffee like Europeans. They were westernized and Europeanized, and of course involved in the oil industry and where that money comes from. So you have normally you get worsening and worsening center-periphery relations. And as I've said, just in alluding to the Spanish as a parallel or something, you get a situation in which what is called democracy in name is in fact hated and resented as Western colonialism, whether or not it wants to wear that name. So, there were, again, I've seen scholars, agonizing over this. At some points, there was to some extent a sincere attempt to create democracy in places like Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. I'd really have to get into details. Well, how do you do that if the communists are really a very popular choice? If you have votes and people want to vote for communists. Now, obviously, if you really believe in democracy, you should let them elect communists. If that's their culture, if those are their values, if the Communist Party stands for election and they get elected, let them. That was not the attitude of the CIA. That was not the attitude of a series of American presidents, including Dwight Eisenhower. A lot more blame has to be placed on Eisenhower's head for everything that went wrong in the 20th century, but including Vietnam War and what have you. We had some legitimate elections in Laos in which the communists were a minority party. They didn't win outright, but they won some seats in parliament and a certain role in government, certain level of representation in their parliamentary systems. And the CIA and the states, they couldn't stand for it, and they freaked out, and they tried to shut down parliament and have fake elections instead. Yeah, they really destroyed the democratic process. So, democracy, and this isn't even talking deeply. This is talking about the shallowest form. This is talking about an imitation, a second-rate knockoff imitation of the British parliamentary tradition. We're not talking about Athenian democracy, direct democracy, or what have you. So he asks, is democracy in itself a virtue? Well, democracy has some virtues. When true democracy, not necessarily just shallow democracy, not parliamentary democracy, not this kind of comprador elite ruling in the name of the democracy, but it's actually colonialism. Real democracy means that people learn from their own mistakes, right? Power remains in the hands of the public, and they're going to make bad decisions and then regret them, and then make different decisions the next time 5 years later or what have you. So, if you really believe in democracy, the question is, do you believe that Afghanistan could, within 50 years, if they had meaningful democracy, do you think they could progress their way out of religious fundamentalism? That's a really meaningful question. If a place like Vietnam or Laos had meaningful democracy, say right after the end of World War II, when the French Empire is falling apart, even if communism was it was maybe one of several popular, political ideologies, do you think they could have had that debate and maybe experimentally tried some of those methods of farming and reorganizing society and gotten disillusioned and moved on and say, hey, people are starving to death because this economic system isn't working. Let's try. I think that really is the question. Is democracy in itself a virtue regardless of the circumstances of its appearance? And the counter argument is what you already see. I mean, this is not the only issue dealt with in Aristotle's Politics, by the way, but it's a big one in Aristotle. In broad brushstrokes, how can you have democracy? How can you have, more broadly, how can you have polity? How can you have a real political community? How can you have a working political system without quite a high level of education, right? So look, I mean, is there a level so low, like, maybe Afghanistan in 2002, in terms of illiteracy and religious fanaticism, what have you, that democracy can't work? So you can draw a dotted line there. I mean, democracy in theory is an anti-elitist ideology, but I think it deserves to be criticized to say it actually has a form of implicit elitism, which, by the way, Aristotle tries to recognize and make explicit. That's why he recoins the term. I looked into it. He wasn't the first person to use the term. He changed it. He basically gave a totally new meaning to the term timocracy. He has democracy and timocracy. He uses it with a totally different meaning than anyone else who used it before. And this is actually recognizing the economic inequality. And I would say, it's not really in that section, I would say also this issue of educational inequality and how that relates to democracy. Okay, so you can jump in anytime, babe, but you don't seem to be jumping a bit. No, I'm happy to have you here. It's cool. All right. So question number 2. This is where I get to this issue of what we want and desire, and why it's important to say this. I think in political and personal discourse. Do you think that nations should care about and intervene in the affairs of other nations? Okay, so I'm going to start by answering this with a want statement, a statement of what I want. Okay, look, even better, even more fundamental. Why is it so important to make statements of I want blank? One of my first videos to do this in a big way, it's, as I say, it's kind of a subtle issue within many of my videos about politics, was my video titled On Community, a video that's been translated into many languages. And I remember just thinking, look, what is the most honest, cutting, deep way for me to, address this? And it's like, okay, no, I've got to set this aside and make an I want statement. Statements of I want, they state your objectives, blah, blah, blah. There's a certain kind of utility to them. But above all else, statements of I want let us evade and discard what I would call the discourse of false necessity. So a lot of political discourse, a lot of ethical discourse, a lot of identity politics is framed in terms of necessity, right? So many vegans will try to construct an argument this way. X, Y, and Z are necessary. Or you can be a feminist who tries to argue, well, X, Y, and Z are necessary. And what does necessary really mean in this sense? I mean, if we try to make the argument that recycling is necessary, of course I know what you mean, but so I mean, veganism is maybe the easiest and simplest example. You try to construe an argument that society can't exist at all, that it can't survive if it doesn't become vegan or something, where you're trying to create a notion of necessity that obviously is false. No, of course. I mean, society has always existed by exploiting animals. It's currently the vast majority of people are. But, I understand they're trying to kind of make an indirect moral argument by appealing to an idea of necessity. But I think this is ultimately a kind of intellectually insincere way to proceed with an argument. So patriarchy. If a feminist is talking about the necessity of abolishing the patriarchy, then the counter argument is, well, I don't know, look at the Dark Ages. Look at the extreme gender inequality we had for centuries and centuries. It's not necessary. Now, the question is, I think it's more honest and direct and useful. What is it you want? What is the society you want to create? And why is that? And what are going to be the advantages and disadvantages? That, I think, is just a more useful way to approach it, rather than to talk about, well, I mean, the ultimate, phony, dishonest form of necessity were the communists, who tried to construe that there was going to be this revolution that would tear society apart, that this was something they knew, they could see the future of the world, that was necessary, and then all these other crazy interpretations creep in due to that myth of false necessity. So creating an ideological abstraction to create a sense of false necessity, I think, is a dishonest way to proceed with this kind of argument. And I'm saying it's more honest if we talk about what we want. So this question: should foreign nations care about and intervene in one another's affairs? It would be so easy to say, oh, well, this is necessary due to human rights. This is necessary due to the United Nations Charter. We can spin out all kinds of phony, false, shallow claims about necessity. What is it we want, or what is it I want? In one word, what it is I'm hoping for here is scrutiny, right? I mean, scrutiny. I mean, this came up for me even in the recent video talking about the nature of peer review. I write something, I come up with an idea. If I only have yes men or only my own employees looking at it, at what point does it get scrutiny? And one of the real questions is, if I come up with a business plan, when I present it to the bank, is the bank really going to evaluate, is this a viable plan for a business? At what point is scrutiny brought to bear on something, whether it's academic, political, economic, or what have you? I mean, recently I told this story at length. I don't know if you heard it in the podcast about the rubber industry in Laos. Plans to expand the rubber industry, and a guy like me is standing there like, well, look, I've scrutinized these reports. I've noticed, there's some contradictions, in the financial projections and so on. Well, who else is going to do that job? I mean, there I am. I was a scholar of Buddhism. It's not remotely my job, but I was capable of bringing scrutiny to bear on that when nobody inside the bubble was doing so, either because they couldn't or they were not incentivized to, right? So, scrutiny is something tremendously valuable, and scrutiny can avert terrible problems. It can also redress terrible problems once they've started. And there is this kind of advantage that detachment brings with scrutiny, where, France can look at what Canada is doing, and Canada can look at what France is doing, and we can learn from one another's mistakes, and we can point out one another's mistakes. So it may seem as if, and many people say this self-righteously, no, scrutiny must be domestic within a democratic system. Well, look, I would love to think about human nature and about democracy, that there's so much scrutiny within a given society, within a given culture, that you don't need scrutiny across cultural lines or across national lines. During World War II, the United States was producing all this propaganda about human equality, propaganda against racism, when their enemy was Nazi Germany. Or in an even more subtle way that was harder for Americans to deal with, they were also doing propaganda against Japanese racism, because the Japanese are racist against the Chinese and Mongolians. Harder for Americans to relate to, right? So stuff about racial equality and the brotherhood of man. The U.S. Army itself, internally within the racism against black people, was unbelievable. I heard a very moving autobiography as a radio documentary. A black man from the United States, and during World War II, so he was an African-American man, and he managed to get into the submarine service. He was in the Navy, and then he moved. He might have moved on to submarines after. I forget if he was in submarines during World War II, but he was in the Navy and submarines. And he had to work really hard to get that posting. And the only job they let him do, this is during the segregation of the Army, was polish boots. So he was a boot black. He was polishing boots. And he had all these stories with the unbelievable racism of white officers against him as a black man in the Army. And he knew, because he saw it, the white men in the Army treated German war criminals better than they treated him. They treated the German POWs, German prisoners of war, people they kept better than he was treated as a black man in the Army. And he had specific anecdotes showing this. He literally wasn't allowed to eat at the same table as the white soldiers. And the German POWs were. The German POWs, so the German prisoners of war, were eating better food than he was eating as a black man in America. So, look, I'll come back to the story just briefly. This shows, scrutiny and detachment. I wish it wasn't true. I wish you could say, well, the hypocrisy here was obvious to everybody. Obviously, Americans just saw, wow, Nazi Germany is the enemy, racism is the enemy, fascism is the enemy, and here within America we have this racism and fascism. So therefore, put all the pieces of the puzzle are laid out on the table for you. Therefore, segregation is wrong. Therefore, how is it, this lie about separate and equal? Why do black people not go to the same schools as white people? Do black people really have a separate but equal Harvard or something? These questions should have been incredibly obvious to everyone, but it's not obvious. It's not obvious because you're not detached. The people involved are a part of the culture. They're internal to the culture. There's an etic versus emic thing going on here. Because you're within the culture, you deeply buy into these cultural values. You don't question it at the same time that you're participating in this war and spouting this propaganda and so on. So for this particular black man himself, I'm sorry, I do not know the guy's name. Maybe someone's going to email me this guy's name because I think he published a book and he did. I forget if it was a book, but he did tours and lectures, talking about his story, and he made a statement about this. I think there was a museum exhibit about his life and some things like this. But, for him, the moment when he questioned the culture he was a member of was that his boat or submarine, I forget which, was shipwrecked. And he washed up on the eastern shore of Canada. So somewhere like Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, one of those places. And he had grown up in segregation America, and he was terrified. So he also, when he washed up, he had hypothermia. So he actually had a period of time where he could see and hear people around him, but he actually couldn't speak and couldn't really move his limbs. He was in this rubbery state where your core temperature has dropped so low that you're not working properly. And, white people, including white women, they stripped him naked. They had to scrub off oil. He had, there was oil spill, from the boat and so on. They had to clean him and then, I think they had to put him in hot water and then wrap him up. They went through this thing. And these people, these were probably, Presbyterians on the east coast of Canada. I don't know who they were. But they weren't racist against black people. Most of them had never met a black person. And they were not at all like the white Americans he'd known in the American South or within the American Army. And they treated him like anyone else. Of course, at first, so, oh, okay, that's funny. This is a black man. And they invited him into his home, into their home. Each soldier each of the people rescued from the shipwreck were put in different homes. And he was in a home with a white family that had a white daughter. And he said the first night he was there, he didn't sleep at all. He was wide awake all night because he absolutely assumed that the KKK or a similar group would come and lynch him. Because where he was from, for a black man to be in a house with a young white woman was just a death sentence. He was absolutely terrified that he was going to be killed. And on the contrary, in the morning when the family got up, they invited him to sit and eat with them at the same breakfast table. They just treated him like anyone else. And they had, meaningless chit-chat with him. And no white person had ever treated him that way before. And it was shocking to him and gave him this parallel in his own mind where suddenly he was comparing the way he was treated in this town in small town Canada to the way he was treated within the United States of America, within the U.S. Army. And it influenced his life in a whole bunch of ways. Among other things, he actually applied for and eventually got a promotion within the Navy to stop just shining shoes. He became a radar technician, and he had a long career and went on to question the racism the society was in. So this is even for the people who are disadvantaged, even for the people who are oppressed by it. He got a jarring perspective from the outside of questioning his cultural assumptions. He was shown in the most visceral way possible you could live with white people as equals. He had that experience. I don't know if it was for 2 weeks or something. He wasn't there for that long. But, this was during the war, so they weren't rescued right away. The Army didn't have the resources to go pick up shipwreck victims right away. So I think he did live in that community for some length of time and got to know those people. And it was possible for black and white people. There was no reason to hysterically fear that everyone was a rapist or any of this crap. This is possible. It's also possible for him to be a radar technician. Where, he started to question the dogma he was raised with. He was raised with the dogma that black people were, intellectually not capable of that kind of work, and that kind of thing. That he was doomed to just polish shoes and so on. So, look, there is something in practice to the outside perspective. For people within Saudi Arabia, they think they can participate in the Olympic Games and not have any female athletes, have a male-only athletic team. And the outside country is saying to them, no, this is actually unacceptable. And then they think, well, we can have female athletes, but they're not going to wear bathing suits. No, it's not acceptable. You can't swim in a burqa in the Olympic Games, So this is a culture. No, this is the shallowest type of cultural challenge. But still, you get my point. Through this kind of international mutual scrutiny, there's a tremendous impetus towards progress, to recognizing or noticing flaws in your own society and system. And, I think what gets worked out is a set of minimum standards. Now, again, within Canada, within my generation, the terrible situation of our First Nations, our Native people, our Indigenous people, whatever you want to say, the vast majority of people were just blind to it. They just didn't want to know, didn't want to hear about it, they didn't want to think about it. We would have benefited enormously if some other country were scrutinizing us that way. We're saying, hey, you don't live up to this minimum standard. I know with Turkey, those questions were asked because Turkey was applying for membership in the European Union, and the European Union would then point out and reply, well, look at how you treat your own ethnic minorities, the Kurdish minority being the most obvious. And at that time, it was literally illegal to buy or sell like an audio CD with a song in Kurdish. Their music and their language was actively being suppressed or theoretically driven into extinction, this kind of thing. Well, you think you meet European standards of human rights or democracy or what have you, and you don't. So some people say, I think sincerely, that, human rights is a domestic affair, democracy is a domestic affair, no outside country should interfere in another country's democracy. And what I'm saying here with this lengthy introduction is no, the exact opposite is true. And I think one of the most fundamental advantages Europe has is just that it's divided into kind of medium-sized and small units of countries that get to scrutinize one another. A country like Norway is in a position to learn from the mistakes made by England and France and Germany, and they're maybe in a position to admire and look up to something going on in Denmark that's correct, or they have all these competing examples of legal and social systems. It's easy to do. For Canada, you got this one giant neighbor next door, and I don't think we learn a whole lot, sadly. I mean, anyway, getting into Canadian politics is another thing, but we're not in that kind of situation of healthy mutual scrutiny, and in this sense, healthy mutual competition. It's not really competition I'm talking about here. It is really just scrutiny. So it's hard to have scrutiny in a democratic society. We're not even really talking about non-democratic societies. So we're not going to talk about scrutiny in a feudal society. It doesn't seem to be that relevant to our discourse. But democracies, they're very good at ignoring problems. I mean, we ignored the situation for the Cree and the Ojibwe and the Mohawks and so on and so forth for decades and decades. America during World War II and during, I would say, the whole Eisenhower period, ignored the status of black people, even though these were kind of enormous ghettos. It was really obvious. It was really embarrassing. Back under segregation, you'd have dignitaries visiting from India, and they wouldn't be able to go to restaurants in the downtown core of a city. You couldn't take them. They counted as black people, and you're racially segregated. Yeah, what are you going to do? So you have the ambassadors from India or something like this. So India didn't yet have its independence then, but you have some kind of representatives coming from India or something, coming to visit a university or something. Like, oh, sorry, well, actually, you're not allowed to drink from this water fountain. You're actually not allowed to use the bathroom here at the university. You're not allowed to. It's ridiculous. You can't eat at this restaurant. You can't do any of the things you might presume you do. Yeah. So anyway, for any former dignitaries, U.S. Baseball League under segregation, they had a lot of talented Hispanic baseball players. Sometimes you'd have two brothers, full-blooded brothers. One would count as being a member of the Negro League, and one would be in the White League, because it was based on their complexion. How dark-skinned you were as an Hispanic person determined whether you were in one baseball league or the other. So, it was totally surreal. Nobody sees a problem. Okay, I can't say nobody. There was a vocal minority of people who saw a problem with this. But I mean, look, in Canada, you try to find the vocal minority of people in the 1930s who saw the problem with what we were doing to First Nations, what we were doing to the Cree, the Ojibwe, the Iroquois. It's a small minority. It's unbelievable how small that minority is. And then as you move forward, but even into the 1960s and so on, really, really grim. And yeah, we would have benefited enormously by that kind of mutual scrutiny. If you want to pop in, babe, pop in. Okay, good. I'm not saying anything that's mortifying my girlfriend here. So yeah, so I said before, we're talking about this in democratic system. There are some examples of non-democratic systems we can talk about that really matter. One of them is the university. So, sorry, this is all under the heading of things I want. I want scrutiny. So I want it to be possible within a university to say, hey, the Chinese language course is not working, right? So people are paying thousands of dollars to learn Chinese. They're sitting in a classroom with 40 students, one professor. The professor presses play on a CD-ROM, and they fill out photocopied worksheets. Guess what? At the end of this process, after 4 years, I speak this much Chinese. And believe me, I did detailed research on this. Believe me, there are quantifiable measures of how ineffective this is as teaching method. So, university system, nobody's elected. In Canada, nobody's publicly accountable. They're not accountable to Parliament. They're not accountable to anyone. They're not accountable to the students. Nothing. And if you say something like that, which I did, it's a real world, I took the complaint forward through all of the democratic and non-democratic means open to me, including I went to Parliament with it. So Parliament and the Ombudsman and the president of the university and the head of the department and so on. This is a really glaring case. And of course, it was in all of their interest to try to shut me down and sweep it under the rug and not acknowledge the problem and what have you. So who can exercise scrutiny in a university system, right? Can the students scrutinize the professors? Can one professor scrutinize another professor? In reality, this is parallel to what I'm pointing out about national and international politics. In reality, scrutiny tends to only creep into the system when it's one university competing with another university, right? When as university, so my university in Canada might say, oh, wow, look at how they teach Chinese in Berlin. They have this really good program and it's winning awards and it's better than us. And they compare and they say, oh, wow, maybe we got to catch up. In Berlin, they have just one teacher with 5 students and they do this different method and their kids actually learn Chinese or something, That's hypothetical, but normally that's how scrutiny is going to rise. So that's tragic. I wish it wasn't true, and I think one of the challenges for real-world parliamentary democracies that I don't regard as democracy in the true sense of the term, again, universities are utterly non-democratic. But one of the questions is how can you foster scrutiny, meaningful scrutiny, within a non-democratic system? How can you do it within a democracy? How can you do it in a non-democratic system? Within the U.S. military. How can people report corruption? Within the U.S. military, how can people report incompetence? Now, I have actually read a little bit about that. You do have some methods. You have, whistleblower policies and what have you. It's tough, right? So, because this is supposed to be a chain of command, and you're going to report your own superior officer is corrupt, is taking bribes, is stealing, or is incompetent. It's tough. So it runs against the authoritarian culture of the military, of the university, and what have you. Mention really briefly, one of the most influential delusions in political science comes from the work of Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant said, oh, well, we have all these wars and conflicts that arise from one country vying with another, so therefore the solution, all we need to do is, Immanuel Kant said, create a group like the European Union or like the United Nations, create a group of nations. His reasoning was the same way that an individual relates to a king, you'll then just have a next level up where the kings relate to a king of kings, the nations relate to a supernation, and then that'll solve the problem, right? And my view, in a sense here, is the exact opposite. The more you aggregate into one massive political unit, the less potential you've got for meaningful scrutiny. And obviously scrutiny, that was also the principle that the United States was built on. Tragically, I think it's failed. But the idea of the separation of powers that begins in begins in France with the Baron de Montesquieu, I believe, and then is transferred to the United States. That was the idea, was that by separating the judiciary from the Congress, by separating things into separate stages, each would scrutinize the other, each would hold the other to be accountable. I would say it has not worked out. All right, so what I've done here in this analysis, again, I've utterly rejected talking about this in terms of necessity. There is no necessity, there's nothing ineluctable that the people of Afghanistan have to emerge from medieval superstition into modernity. There's no ineluctable progress from feudalism to democracy. There's no necessity to it. The people of China can remain in a state of dictatorship forever. There's no necessity, to achieving democracy. On the contrary, when you look at the history of the world, you have brief periods when governments had real democracy or little bits and pieces of democracy. What was it, in Rome? Maybe 27 years of them having just a bit of democracy under a republic that was in some ways, aristocratic and in some ways tyrannical, but a little piece of democracy for a few years there, and then centuries of rule by emperors. It's ridiculous. So, and I'm mentioning this because there's a view that was made even more popular by the success of Francis Fukuyama. Francis Fukuyama published a book called The End of History, but the reason why that book was so popular was that people already wanted to believe that there's an inevitable progress to the history of the world from peasant societies to modern Western democracy, that this was an inevitable and natural progress, and that we can look at these things in terms of necessity. Anyway, so it was popular because that was something that people already wanted to believe. And instead, and so I think, that's a classical example of what I said, 30 minutes ago in the video, of creating an ideological illusion and then arguing in terms of a false necessity, relative to that illusion. And I think the way to move forward, in all honesty, instead, is just to say, this is what I want. And what I want, what does it entail, for better or worse, with what advantages and disadvantages. So sorry, it's now getting late. I can see most. Yeah, my girlfriend's falling asleep. But I was going to say, so look, briefly. I mean, I'm sorry. It's a topic I'm passionate about, and that's why it's worth doing a video about. But, you had people respond to your video about having a baby. So having a baby raised the issue of natalism and antinatalism. You had people respond to that video by saying, you're just speaking in your own self-interest. They use some other words of that, like selfishness or something. I don't know if you remember the term. Egoism and this kind of thing, right? Okay. So I want to live in a democratic society. That's what I want. It's my self-interest. It's my selfishness. It's my egoism. I am not going to lie to you like this is a force of nature like gravity, or this is a necessity, or this is, what am I? No, this is what I want. Now, is it good or bad? We can talk about that. I would like to see genital mutilation of babies abolished. I would like to see circumcision abolished, male circumcision, female circumcision. How are we going to accomplish that? Obviously, you can talk about public education. You can talk about all kinds of things. You could talk about, whether you use human rights discourse or not, however you want to advance that. But what am I going to tell you? This is ultimately something I want. This is about desire, and whether or not I can convince other people to, recognize my desires as real. I'm not going to tell you it's selfless. I'm not going to tell you it's self-abnegating or it's self-sacrificing. No, we're ultimately, we're talking about questions of what we want and what we don't want. We're talking about desires and animus and all these things. So this is a deeply phony attitude that desire is something outside of real politics, that real politics is a world of just managing necessities, and that human desires are something quite outside that. Now, just to briefly kind of go over the other categories, but I want to live in a society where 12-year-old girls can go to McDonald's unaccompanied. I mentioned this. That always struck me, living in downtown Toronto. And I know many people who go to Japan from more dangerous parts of the world. They notice that in Japan, children can go places without their parents. That's right. When we moved to a certain part of China, Melissa comes from Detroit. Detroit's pretty banged up. And you were amazed the extent to which children just, with their friends were going places, doing things alone, unaccompanied by the adults. So probably going to buy ice cream or something, Yeah, go to, now, of course, anyway, I'd prefer if these 13-year-old girls were buying vegan food at McDonald's, but this is unrelated to my current discourse. Whatever it is they're buying at McDonald's, we don't need to know for this. Now when you even just think about that desire and all the societies that don't have it, a lot of implications come out of that, right? There are a lot of requirements. If you want to have a society where 12-year-old girls can go to McDonald's unmolested or without fear, without parents, disallowing it. Think about what's built in that situation culturally, in terms of crime, in terms of poverty, in terms of drug addiction, in terms of infrastructure, and I think, frankly, in terms of levels of education. Obviously, women's education, and role in the workforce included. Actually, I mean, this one kind of fragment of what it means to have a modern Western parliamentary type society, which does, I mean, it's a big difference between life in Canada and life in some other parts of the world. There's a lot, built into it. And, that's a very real, very tangible example with a human face. Now, if somebody says to me, by contrast, they want to destroy the patriarchy, I don't really know what that means. I don't really know what that entails, but that's something, and indeed for Afghanistan today, that may be unattainable for, many years to come. How can you get to being in a society where some of that is attainable? So, it's been a subtle, but I think for me, profound point that's come up in many other videos of wanting to switch from a discourse about necessity to a discourse about desire. And one of the differences is there's a kind of ineluctably self-critical, what's the word I'm looking for? There's a kind of, there's kind of vulnerability you open yourself up to when you say, this is what I want, And as I said, even in my video on community, my vegan manifesto video, I say, look, I want this, I don't have it. And maybe I can't have it. Maybe this isn't going to happen in my lifetime, but this is my goal. That puts you in a vulnerable place. And I think the reason for building up these towers of abstraction and ideology is exactly that people don't want to admit that to themselves. That this is just about your desires, and your desires may be pathetic or unattainable or what have you. And people today, healthcare in the United States, I want to live in a country where access to medical care is not based on the ability to pay. I can state that inversely. I want to live in a country in which poor people are never refused surgery due to their lack of ability to pay. But I'm simplifying it. I mean, I'm just trying to simplify down to where I don't want to live in a country where one person will die of a heart attack and another person will live because of their ability to pay. I want to put it this way. They have the same condition, and one person gets good treatment and the other person gets none, and one person gets good treatment and the other person gets worse treatment for heart attacks, cancer, you name it. That's what I want. I can't sell you this myth of fake necessity. There isn't going to be a revolution if we fail to provide it. America has carried on this way for a very long time, right? It can carry on this way for centuries more, tragically or what have you, right? I'm not going to sell you on any of these other notions of necessity. But as you know, also coming back to the other themes of this video, the main way people engage in this discourse, even within the United States, is to say, why is it America can't have that when Portugal has it, Scotland has it, Taiwan has it. There are all these other countries, Japan to some extent. They all have a working healthcare system that takes care of the poor. Different story in each place, one way or another. whether you think Denmark is better than Scotland or have you. It's like, well, this is attainable for everyone else. So again, it actually still is this issue of mutual scrutiny across cultures and across borders with some sense of detachment. Because when you live within that bubble, when that's the only thing you know, it's maybe harder to come to that perspective and harder to come to that judgment. Okay, guys, I think this video has gone on long enough, but ultimately, it is a fallacious argument to say you only want to have a baby because that's what you want. And that's how the antinatalists tried to refute you, right? It's a fallacious argument to say you only want to have a democratic society because that's what you want. It's tautological. I mean, what have you proven or disproven? You're correct. This is something I want. And I'm willing to talk about that with all the vulnerability that entails. I'm not going to take up my position on the sort of, illusory stand that, the inevitability of history is on my side. The weight of, the progress of science is on my side. It's like, no, I mean, I identify as a nihilist. But I don't believe any of that. No, with all due humility and all due vulnerability, I'm going to express to you my vision of what the future of society should be like. I'm going to express to you what I want. I'm going to look around and say, hey, who's with me? Who can try to make something positive happen? What are the next steps we can take? If you want this too, if you also see cracks in the facade of maybe the things we take for granted, maybe the evils in our society that have become invisible to us because we live within that society, whether we can challenge that through just the application of scrutiny sui generis within our culture, scrutiny looking across the border to some other society, scrutiny by reading science fiction even. I mean, some ideas have arisen that way, thinking about another society that could be. That's the origin of the word utopia. Thomas More's utopia was science fiction of a sort. That one way or another, we have to use scrutiny to make those cracks, to bring out those new ideas, to express those desires, and find a way forward. Mohammed, thank you for your question. I will see you in Brussels.